So before starting, maybe it's appropriate to have a short moment of silence to commemorate the victims and the first responders and everybody who are affected by the 9/11. Okay, thanks. So welcome to the third annual trade panel. Professor Jagdish Bhagwati has been leading numerous trade conferences and symposiums since he arrived at Columbia in 1980. But there is a special sense of urgency to the discussion of trade and protectionism today. I'm not a trade economist, but I do not recall any time in recent history when free trade and more generally globalization have been threatened the way it is right now. Nor do I recall any time in recent history our president has shown the kind of disdain that we are seeing for multilateralism and the rules-based trading system right now. So this evening's panel of distinguished scholars and policy advisors across the aisle spanning both Bush and Obama administrations will be discussing these issues and a whole lot more of other issues. This evening's event is being live streamed, so we are living in this modern age. So welcome to our viewers online. I encourage you to follow the conversation also on Twitter using #TradeProtectionism. So before proceeding to the main event, let me give a small word for our sponsoring organizations. Today's event is made possible by Jerome A. Chazon Institute for Global Business at Columbia Business School and the Center on Global Economic Governance, which is part of CEPA. And finally, the Program for Economic Research, which is part of the Department of Economics. Let me add a small plug for our organization, Program for Economic Research, PER in short. We were established in 2005 with a mission to support the research of faculty and students, but an equally important part of our mission is to hold events like today's to talk about issues that we care about and to serve the broad broad outreach community. This term, we have a few interesting events lined up, so perhaps you might be interested to know about them. Later this week, we'll have a microeconomic theory conference. That'll be the Friday and Saturday, and it will be organized by Qingmin Liu and Marina Halash. In October, we'll have Jonathan Gruber from MIT to talk about the state of the healthcare reforms and public policy. And later that month, our own Harrison Hong and Jose Schenkman will lead a conference on strategies for financing climate solutions, another issue that we care about. In early December, we'll have our annual Arrow lecture, and this year the lecture will be special because of Ken Arrow passing this February. So in addition to the regular lecture, which will be given by Glenn Lowry on discrimination, we'll have a special symposium to commemorate his work and legacy. Okay. Again, it's a special honor to kick off the season with this trade panel, and especially privileged to have with us Professor Jagdish Bhagwati to moderate the event. Professor Bhagwati requires no special introduction. He is indeed an iconic figure of our department, a leading scholar, a public intellectual, policy advisor, and of course, a champion of free trade. So without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to Professor Bhagwati. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, as you pointed out, we've had so many conferences on international trade that one has lost count. There was just one last year, then the one 2 years before that, and so on. And somehow trade keeps recurring all the time. I think Leif Pagrotsky, the famous trade minister of Sweden, was at one of them. And why does trade keep coming up again and again? For those of us who work on trade, there's never any resting point. I mean, once you are into free trade, you will be there forever. It's like catching a tiger by the tail. You can't let go. If you let go, protectionists will take over. So you can never celebrate the fact that you won the contest and protectionists are on the run. We used to think that from time to time, undoubtedly, and we're always disappointed. So I've often felt that someday I will be able to get rid of foreign trade, international trade, is something I have to write about. And then I can concentrate on other interesting topics like immigration, environment, etc., on which I want to write. But it never happens because I'm always drawn back. And unfortunately, this is a situation for all free traders, that protectionists are like New York's cockroaches that just don't die out. I mean, you just have to cope with them all the time. So I think this is, what I want to do is right now, is to introduce this very distinguished panel, which we have assembled, who will deal with different aspects of the problem. So let me give you a very quick rundown on the kinds of issues, so to be able to tie it all together, because we gave it a considerable amount of thought to what are the issues today which we want to really focus on. Okay? So I think as I said, there's a sense of déjà vu about what's going on. And I think let me just mention that it is tempting to think, and it's just very easy to think, that all the fallacies on trade today in this country come from Donald Trump. A fair number do, of course, as we know. But on the other hand, there are some fallacies which are common, which are part of the DNA in this country. And I'll soon mention the common fallacies, then focus on the ones which President Trump deserves full credit for, and then talk a little bit about the democratic fallacies, which are also very strong and considerable, to make it really a full menu, which will actually be a good background for our panel. So I'll go fairly quickly first at the common fallacies. One is that trade openness harms the overall economy, meaning GDP or GNP or national income or whatever, but the aggregate amount of income. And this is something where voluntary trade, of course, is supposed to be what we are talking about, not enforced trade or anything of that kind. This is a mutual gain kind of hypothesis which international trade economists in the classroom frequently talk about, that if you enter into voluntary exchange, both parties are going to be better off relative to not having that opportunity. On the other hand, we've always had to deal with what I've called malign impact models, not benign impact, where everybody gains. And I think malign impact is something, for those of us who come from developing countries, we know this. We've always had to deal with this phenomenon. Because in the developing countries in particular, there was always a view that if you went into international trade, into open trade, that you could actually get screwed by it, that you would be harmed and not helped. So this is a malign impact. There's also malign intent, like, the more disturbing thesis with, like neocolonialism and so on. But certainly malign impact was something we talked about. So how could you possibly compete with people that, who had been brought up on Gerber food and steaks and so on from the age of 2? They would be strong, and our emaciated people couldn't possibly compete with them. That was the way it was set up. So how could we possibly gain? Today, the thing has come around, and it's the developed countries which are now talking like that. They say, how can we compete with all these emaciated people? We can't possibly do that. So the notion that there is a malign impact on the aggregate income is itself something which one has to contend with. And I think, we'll be talking about that, I have no doubt. And then the famous phrase for this was that integration into the international economy will lead to disintegration of the national economy. That's a very classic phrase which we used to use. Now, the evidence shows that openness, in fact, and growth of GNP or GDP are strongly correlated. My friend Danny Roderick says that the relationship is probably the other way around. And there's here what we economists call an identification problem. What causes what? And of course, you know the story, the way we explain this in the classroom, is that there is a particular country, which some of you may guess at, where the men are bad lovers and the women are bad cooks. Now, which is causing what, right? Are the men being punished because with bad food because they're bad lovers, or is it really the other way around? Okay, so I think this is it's you know, what causes what is really an issue. Now, Danny Roderick obviously feels that we really have to have that trade doesn't cause growth; growth causes trade. Now, I don't think this is something where there's a fair amount of evidence, and I'll just leave it at that, and if anybody wants to pick it up. But today, this is something which we do have a fair amount of evidence on. And I don't know if Professor Panagaria is here, but he's got a very classic article examining the post-war evidence, you know, with large sets of data. And we also have lots of detailed studies of individual countries, which I think is a better way to do it than through running regressions of this kind. Now, in turn, we have a second problem. If growth is actually coming about as a result of trade, how is that any good for poverty? And this is something we're going to do a little bit later on the income distribution problem. So does growth help poverty? And here again, there's a fair amount of evidence that it does. And that what it does basically is to provide opportunity again for people to be able to rise out of, you know, being very poor and taking advantage of the opportunity. And there's a fair amount of evidence on that too. And so I think that is something. So I've, you know, in some of my writings and other people also have called it, growth is supposed to be a trickle-down strategy. So almost implying that, you know, everybody's at a table enjoying leg of lamb and venison and so on, and some crumbs fall to the serfs and the dogs below. And that is a sort of trickle down. It's inadvertent, but it's actually an activist pull-up strategy where, you know, providing opportunity, so which is a more radical way of thinking about it. And that's the way many countries, certainly India, were thinking about it. Not as a conservative strategy, but as a radical strategy. How do you bring about greater growth and therefore greater opportunity, etc.? And I think, again, there's a fair amount of evidence on that. So we can tie up growth, and then first trade to growth, and then growth to effect on poverty. So I think that is something we will be dealing with. Now, why do we hear, nonetheless, in the liberal media like New York Times and Washington Post, frequently say that the developing countries are agitated and agitating against trade openness? And I think this is simply wishful thinking or non-thinking on their part. Again, there is a Punch cartoon which shows dervishes in the desert, and they're reading Al-Aram, you know, the Cairo newspaper, and one is telling the other, it says we are in ferment. And, you know, it's absolutely quiet. The guys here who write about agitation and unhappiness in the poor countries do not realize that this is not true. This is their own wishful thinking, and that in fact, many countries are looking for trade opportunity now, and they see it as a pathway to greater benefits. So I think, again, we don't need to worry about it. Okay, in the evening panel, we'll be dealing with these issues. And then the next one is concentration of income. And here again, I think Devashish Mitra is going to show that openness to trade was not associated with higher poverty rates. And the Piketty argument will also be evaluated, because his is the sort of major Western contribution to this. And it's a sort of the French school of thought. Next, fallacy, shrinking of manufacturers. This is not well known, and this is what Phil Levy is going to deal with. And it's Trump fallacy for sure, most definitely, that openness to trade has lost us jobs and the ability to do manufactures. Because if you draw a simple chart on what has happened to manufacturers everywhere, it's a downward trend. So just as people got out of agriculture into manufacture, people are going out of manufacturers into tradable services. So it's not as if we are losing our manufacturers to China or to somebody else in the poor countries. So again, that's a fallacy which has been exploded, and I think Phil Levy will be dealing with that for sure. And also with the Navarro and MIT, there's also obsession with China, which I think is, that's again very much at the heart of the Trump thinking about the subject, and that obsession is something which we need to address. My own feeling is that China is a problem, and I think if you look at Japan during the 1930s, Japan was growing fast and had a high ratio of trade to GNP. So it was creating waves in the outside world. I mean, so it was like a giant in a Lilliputian world economy. And today, China is like that also, except that it's creating waves at more than one level. Because with Japan, it was just through exporting goods continuously. So we were saying, don't export so much, have voluntary export restraints. But China is also absorbing large amounts of raw materials. So it's creating waves also for people who use the raw materials here. So it's like a double whammy. And so in my opinion, to be able to deal with China, which is gigantic in the world economy, you have to think it through very carefully. But I'm sure Phil Levy will do that. Then there's another fallacy, which is there's nothing more to be gained from trade liberalization. And this is something which is simply not true. It's a Roderick fallacy. We've had enough. There's nothing more to be gained. Why undertake disruption? You know, it's not worth it. And anybody who knows international trade literature would not subscribe to this rubbish. So the other one is WTO is not for us, and that's a Trump fallacy. And others gain, we don't, from the WTO, and Petros Mavroidis will be dealing with that. Then there's the Wilbur Ross fallacy, that the GATT is biased against importers. And I think Chad will be partly dealing with that. And this again betrays ignorance because in fact, GATT was formed against the 1930s background of exports, continuous, disruptive exports from Japan. So when we were doing GATT, all the focus was on how to protect ourselves against Japanese exports. So export performance was not really at issue. All the things we put into the GATT were actually on how to safeguard our import competing industries. So again, Wilbur Ross cannot be accused of knowing GATT history, but that's not the only thing one can accuse him of. Then bilateral deficits matter. That's a very common fallacy, and I think again Chad will be dealing with that. Then let me just come to the developing countries, that we are not, GATT is biased against developing countries. And that's simply not true. Anyone who knows GATT history knows we've got special and differential treatment. If anything, we exempted developing countries from having to do anything at all. And I think that is what accounted for the fact that many of the, if you don't do anything, if you don't give anything, you don't get anything in international trade. And therefore, what you got was a situation where the trade liberalization of the developed countries was very much in favor of products which are of interest to them, not of any interest to the developing countries. So when developing countries began to play, then the situation began to change. So I think it is something where the S&D was part of the problem, in my opinion. Finally, on the democratic fallacies, and I'll just finish with that. One, of course, is that Paul Samuelson was a protectionist. We know that he was not. He was talking about exogenous events like what we are getting in Miami right now, massive disruption due to a bad monsoon, hurricane. If that happens, the question, of course, is how do you react to that? Do you react to that by shutting off trade of Miami with all the rest of the world? That would only compound the error, right? Compound the difficulty. But that was something which Hillary Clinton and her advisors really believed that Samuelson had shown, which he had not, that really protectionism was good. All he had shown was that you could be hurt by outside forces, and therefore it had nothing to do with protectionism. If you went in for protectionism, that would be worse. Every conceivable trade economist, good and bad, came out against the Hillary Clinton interpretation and said this was wrong. But of course, she's supposed to be cat's whiskers on, on intellectual matters, and she, of course, was quite wrong on this one. And finally, the Buffett fallacy. Buffett actually said, and this is the one on which I will finish, because I've run out of time. And the Buffett fallacy was simply that the way to solve the balance of payments was to make sure that nobody imported more than the aggregate export performance. Those of you who are from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., will know this. This is a common fallacy, that we do this. Because if you start doing that, you will definitely balance your trade, but you'll be going steadily downhill. You'll be balanced trade in decreasing levels of income. And that being the case, I've compared it, in Pravin Krishna, as a fallacy where you have essentially, you say, the way to deal with a beast which is suffering from dysentery is to plug it up from behind. Of course, it will cure the dysentery, but the beast will die. And that's the kind of fallacy that you have with Warren Buffett. And unfortunately, he too might be influential, if not just with the Democrats, but also with President Trump, because President Trump listens to businessmen quite a bit. So now, Chad, would you like to take over?
So thank you, Jagdish, and thanks to everybody here at Columbia for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. It's a huge honor. I'm looking at my phone, not because I'm tweeting, but because I'm setting my timer so that I do my best to keep to time, because I have a tendency to run over. So indeed, it's an honor to be here, but it's absolutely true. There's probably never been a more exciting time to be working actively in international trade and trade policy. And to highlight that, I should do one little bit of self-promotion in addition for whatever reading materials you have about me. So with the economist and journalist Sumaya Keynes of The Economist, it's actually, the world has been calling for a trade podcast that we've decided to launch. So if you don't get enough out of tonight's panel about your trade interests, go onto iTunes and search for Trade Talks, which is our new trade policy podcast where you can hear all about all of this stuff in much more detail. Okay. The title that I am going with tonight is, Are 1980s Trade Policies Appropriate for Today? Are 1980s trade policies appropriate for today? And in particular, what the United States is doing and the Trump administration is doing. And so I'm going to organize my remarks around maybe 3 points. The first is the ways in which they're actually borrowing from 1980s trade policies, that they have been at least trying to borrow thus far in the administration from 1980s trade policies, and what we might continue to see from them going forward. The second will be what they're ignoring, both from the 1980s and from what we've learned from the 1980s over the intervening 25, 30 years that they're not pursuing in terms of trade policy. And then my third and final point will be the actual problems out there in the trading system that they're ignoring. And so this will get into a point that Jagdish was highlighting, which is China. Now, it's not necessarily the problems with China that the Trump administration is highlighting, but I do see some actual major frictions that the West, the United States, Europe, Japan, is having with China that need to be addressed for the world trading system to function, that I'm going to argue the Trump administration is ignoring. Okay, but so have that in the back of your mind, China, and it will be a thread through which we can understand a lot of my remarks. But first I want to start with how the Trump administration is actually borrowing from the trade policies of the 1980s. and I'm going to point to 3 in particular. So the first is a set of country-specific import restrictions that they're using to stop imports from coming in from certain partners. And so by this I mean policies that you probably would have heard of, things like anti-dumping, countervailing duties, so anti-subsidy, unfair trade policies. The idea is either trading partners, their firms, or their governments are doing something that's unfair. They're dumping their product into the United States market, or their firms are getting subsidies that our firms aren't getting. So the prices of the goods coming into the market are too low. They're injuring U.S. companies, and that's a cause for imports. Okay, fine. So that's one policy that not only the Trump administration has used, but the Obama administration used it, the Bush administration, the Clinton, all successive U.S. administrations have used this. But with respect to China, at this point in time, by my calculations, we have already about 9, almost 10% of imports coming in from China that have already been affected by these kinds of trade policies. And that decreases the amount of leverage that you have to be able to do more of this kind of stuff with respect to China. And so we're using this already to basically stop the imports from China coming in industries like steel, in aluminum, and a lot of things like that. Okay? Now, does this deal with whatever underlying problems that we might have, the United States might have with China? I would argue no, because what happens in a global trading system? China exports a lot of these products to third countries. So if we're talking about steel, it's a relatively homogeneous product. China just exports those products to third countries instead. And other countries, through what economists call trade diversion, the United States imports from those countries instead. So none of the underlying problems that one might have with China are being addressed. The imports are still coming in, with the exception of now we're starting to see country-specific trade policies, these anti-dumping policies in particular, starting to get imposed on friends and allies of the United States. So in the steel industry, for example, the United States imposed anti-dumping import restrictions on steel on the United Kingdom for the first time in 15 years. So since, way before Brexit, of course, but dating back to, I think, 2001, right? Okay, country-specific trade policies, that's the first. The second, and this is really a new one that they're dusting off, is something called the global safeguard, or the Section 201 policy in the United States context. And this thing is another one of these policies that's authorized by the WTO, by the international trading system. This one is different in the sense that there's no allegation that trading partners have done anything that's unfair. But it's also different in the sense that you're not supposed to apply it just against the particular countries, the imports coming in from that one country, but basically globally on a most favored nation or a non-discriminatory basis. So we have 2 of these cases that are ongoing now in the United States that have been started since the Trump administration came into office. The first is on solar panels, solar modules. The second is on washing machines. A second related policy in the sense that it's also designed potentially to be applied on a non-discriminatory basis is this national security law that the Trump administration has triggered. So this is Section 232 of the U.S. Trade Act, I think, of 1962. So we have all of our legal historians and scholars here at the table that are nodding that I have it roughly correct. So this is not frequently used law. It was triggered by the Trump administration to investigate whether imports of steel and then aluminum were a threat to U.S. national security. Now, in each of these cases, it turns out that whether we're talking about solar panels, solar modules, steel, aluminum, maybe even washing machines, if part of the underlying concern in these cases is something that China is doing wrong, something that they're doing incorrectly in economic terms that we might be worried about, and I'll get to this in a moment. Because of the United States' use of these country-specific trade policies, the anti-dumping, the countervailing duties, we've already stopped the imports from China of steel from coming in, of aluminum from coming in, and of solar panels from coming in. So if you're going to impose these MFN, these non-discriminatory import restrictions in these sectors, it's going to affect imports from, again, our friends and allies, right? So Canada, Mexico, Europe. So these policies, the last time the Section 201 policy was used was in 2001 under the Bush administration, a massive set of import restrictions on steel. It was more frequently used in the 1980s under the Reagan administration and in the 1990s, but it really hasn't been utilized all that frequently since. The third policy that the Trump administration has just dusted off, and we really haven't seen this one in a while, and we thought this one was gone forever, I think, is Section 301. So this is one of my favorites because when I was a graduate student, I read Jagdish's writings about this. This was referred to at the time as the aggressively unilateral U.S. trade policy. So here, the current case started just last month as the Trump administration is investigating whether China is engaging in, through policies like whether there are forced joint ventures between American companies that seek access to the Chinese market. So if you think about an automobile company, they have some great technology, they want to sell their cars into China. Well, in order to do so, they have to engage in a joint venture with a Chinese firm. The problem is, in the automobile case at least, the Chinese firms are state-owned enterprises. And arguably, they're asked to transfer some of their technology to the local partner as well, right? So there's concern about intellectual property rights protection and this sort of pay for play. Now, under this law, in the 1980s, what the United States would do under this law is it would investigate whether the trading partners were doing something that was wrong. They were both the investigator, then they would be the judge themselves. They would rule on whether the trading partner was doing something wrong. And they would ultimately then, if found to having done something wrong, they would mete out the punishment, and typically in the form of threats of retaliatory tariffs. And this would happen even in areas where there weren't necessarily explicit international rules. At the time in the 1980s, we didn't have great international rules in trade. It was basically just trade in goods under the GATT at that moment in time. There was very little covering trade in services, foreign investment, or intellectual property rights. Okay? But this is how the United States behaved at the time. Now, here's the underlying concern that I see with the current U.S. approach to doing this. So right now they're just doing an investigation. We'll see what ultimately happens out of that investigation. But in my mind, there's maybe two things that come out of that. The first is that they find that China has done something out of this internal investigation that basically violates WTO rules. Well, if they decide upon that, then the way the system's rules are basically written is they're supposed to use the WTO. They're supposed to use the WTO's dispute settlement understanding to pursue an actual trade dispute against China and not just act unilaterally like we were doing in the 1980s. If they don't find that China has done something that violates WTO rules, but China is still engaging in sort of unfair trade practices, well, then they're also kind of caught in a bind, right? You could act unilaterally, but you're acknowledging that China hasn't really broken any rules by doing what it is that they're doing. And so by acting unilaterally, China will have a case against you and say, hey, the United States is acting outside of the system, retaliating against us, and implicitly they're not arguing that we've actually broken any rules. Okay, so what's missing from today with the Trump administration and trade policy? Well, one thing I'd expected we might see from them that we haven't yet are voluntary export restraints, and maybe we will see some of those. I think arguably why we haven't seen some of those, and so the current U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, was in the Reagan administration and negotiated some of these arrangements in the 1980s. I think arguably why we haven't seen some of those yet is the United States doesn't have as much leverage as vis-a-vis China on a lot of these issues as it did in the 1980s vis-a-vis Japan. So certainly in the areas of steel and aluminum, because we've already stopped the imports from coming in, we have very little steel or aluminum trade leverage with China to be able to get them to engage in voluntary export restraints. Now, there has been this dialogue about whether or not China is going to rein in capacity that may go to this OECD forum, and so we'll see how that plays out. But that's certainly something that we might expect to see. The other major differences, though, is especially on the Section 301 case. What was happening when the United States was doing this in the 1980s, the Section 301, the aggressive unilateral behavior, the rest of the world didn't really like it. But the United States had a carrot out there at the same time, where it was negotiating the Uruguay round under the GATT. And so basically was telling the world, if you don't like us behaving like this, acting unilaterally, hey, let's enact some new rules. Let's develop rules for trade and services, intellectual property, investment, and that's what ultimately ended up happening. Right now, there's nothing similarly going on between the United States and these major concerns that it has with China. The third point, what's missing today, is the Trump administration's not only engagement in that dimension, but engagement within the WTO system through dispute settlement. And there, one of the consequences, arguably, coming out of the behavior of the aggressive unilateralism of the 1980s of the United States and the Uruguay round was a well-functioning dispute settlement process under the WTO. that has been incredibly effective over the last 20 years, including by the United States, that has won almost all of the disputes that it has brought against other countries. We haven't seen, certainly the Trump administration embrace the WTO, but we really haven't even seen any strong signals yet that they're going to use the WTO and its dispute settlement processes in any sort of fashion to engage U.S. interests. Even taking up the number of the disputes that the Obama administration had left teed up for them ready to go. There's a case ongoing that they could take on aluminum, these subsidies in China, and a number of other issues as well. Okay, so that then leads me to conclude with my last point, which is we do face in the international trading system serious concerns. And these would have been there even if Donald Trump hadn't been elected president. The fact that after 15 years of being in the WTO, China just hasn't naturally become a market economy. It hasn't transformed into something that's recognizable by the United States, by Europe, by Japan, by the established members of the international trading system. It hasn't gotten there. It's not headed in that direction. And so that raises the question of, is the current system well designed? Are the rules well suited to an interface between market economies and China? And the answer there, I don't think, is necessarily yes. We're seeing a lot of conflict, and I don't think that the current system can necessarily solve it. So what do? What's the Trump administration's strategy to deal with that concern? And there I don't have an answer. And I don't see any signs yet of any well thought out or well developed strategy. Now, maybe it's still early, but I don't see any signals yet about what their long-term intentions are. And that's quite different from the Obama administration. You could differ with the Obama administration and disagree with the strategy that they had taken, but they had an explicit strategy, which was, we're going to design this agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's going to have rules in there about things that we're worried about with China. Now, it may not be perfect, but eventually we want to set up this arrangement with the hope that 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, China will want to accede to this agreement. So we're going to set up rules in there for state-owned enterprises that we're worried about with China, electronic commerce, data flows, privacy, intellectual property rights, labor, environment, with the hopes that that someday might get China back to the negotiating table, because right now, or previously, China hadn't been willing to engage with the United States in the WTO forum in any sort of effective way. Now, the Obama administration wasn't successful in pulling that off, ultimately because TPP was never enacted. Who knows if it would have ultimately been successful in confronting the concerns that the United States has with China, but it was a strategy. With the Trump administration, at least thus far, I haven't been able to really identify what the long-term goals and approach ultimately is, even though there is a desperate need for us to be doing something. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Danjevad, for the invite. So I was asked to speak a little bit about the Trump attitude towards WTO dispute settlement. And quite frankly, I mean, my original response when we spoke was, I don't know, because it's highly confusing. And anyway, I tried to make some sense of what I see so far in the 1 year of Trump administration. And my point is this, I mean, I start looking, and I'll give you an example, I'll explain why this is the case. If you look at the WTO dispute settlement, the procedures is a copy of the US wish list during the negotiations. All of the negotiators aimed to please the US. The quid pro quo was abandon unilateral enforcement through Section 301. Now, when it comes to the quality of decisions, in my view, this is largely function of appointments. Why? This is a highly incomplete contract. My co-author, Henry Horn, has a couple of papers saying it's obligationally incomplete. They leave a lot of discretion to the interpreter, and it matters who you appoint there. Still, the US wins 70% of all claims, which I take claims as a unit of account because it's difficult to say who wins a dispute. A victory could be a defeat, and a defeat could be a victory. But if you take claims as a unit of account, the US is the highest winner of them all, along with the European Union. But this fact notwithstanding, there is a malaise in the Trump administration. I don't think there is a reason to panic, because the US administration so far talks the talk but does not walk the walk. But the talk is destructive and confusing, and this is what I will try to show you here. So I start with the original WTO dispute settlement. Bagwati Patrick have this 1990 book. They look into Section 301. They look empirically, they look theoretically as well, but the empirics I care about a lot here. US is unhappy with adjudication in the GATT, to a large extent justified. The European Union lost a number of cases which put into question the consistency of common agricultural policy, which was a system of variable levies which essentially excluded imports from the European market for most farm markets. And Europe refused over time after time, to implement the report. So what do? You go, you win, you win, you win. Eventually you get upset, you start enforcing your rights unilaterally. That's fine, but there is a big part of Section 301, again, if you look at the numbers, the overwhelming part of Section 301, where the US essentially imposes unilateral preferences. They take India, they take Brazil to the court, and they say you violate IP protection. But what are they violating exactly? Because they think they respect their own domestic laws and there is no international law, neither for IP nor for services. Still, the US, they take justice in their own hands, and time after time, they take cases against Brazil and India, and they impose to a large extent their will. Now, this was the reality during the Uruguay round, when the Uruguay round starts. So what was the negotiation on dispute settlement? I had to check all the negotiating history. I think I checked all of it. For the handbook by Bagwell and Steger, when we were there together. So if you look at the negotiating history, each and every WTO member had the proposal to strike down Section 301. So what do you need for Section 301 to be eliminated, essentially? Nobody liked the unilateral enforcement of rights. So the quid pro quo was what? Take the US Section 301 deadlines and introduce them into the WTO. Remove the possibility to unilaterally block adoption of reports. You must implement, and so on and so forth. So when we left the room of negotiations, everybody thought the US should be happy because their own system of doing adjudicating disputes was now taken over at the WTO dispute settlement. Still, a few years, 20 years later, the US is very unhappy. Now, the unhappiness is recent. I mean, it's the last year, year and a half. Here, what I put here is just official documents by the US delegation. I see a lot in the press attributed to different people. I don't care about these things. What has the US been unhappy about? The Korean appellate body member. I don't even want to enter into this discussion because, quite frankly, it's beyond ridicule. But the second thing where they made a little bit more noise was the case law on zeroing. Zeroing is a practice in anti-dumping where you zero positive margins of dumping and you inflate the dumping margin. The US, first of all, the amount of trade involved, Chad has a couple of papers, is ridiculously low. I mean, you would never think that the serious administration would take this and make it the flagship of fighting dispute settlement in the WTO. But moreover, I mean, the US keeps making the point this is an attack on US sovereignty, but I don't see, and not like me, I think the majority of people who read the anti-dumping jurisprudence, where is the problem? Because there was no agreement that zeroing is legal during the Uruguay round. There was a disagreement, clear disagreement. And the compromise was, let's go for fair comparisons. Well, if you have a method which consistently inflates dumping margins, how on earth can you call it fair? I mean, you might agree or disagree, but you cannot say this is an attack on US sovereignty. And it's not just the US delegates in Geneva. I mean, the wider trade agenda, when I was looking at the Trump policy agenda 2017, he makes 4 points. 2 of the 4 points concern dispute settlement. Again, not very disaggregated, but the tone is the same, defend US sovereignty, enforce US laws, blah, 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 blah. I don't understand much what it means, but what bothers me is precisely the fact that I don't understand what it means, and it's quite confusing. The USTR Lighthizer, Chad sent me this paper, has a testimony concerning US-China Economic Security Council cooperation. Now, when you read this testimony, you say, what exactly does the US want? On the one hand, there is an accusation the WTO dispute settlement has not lived up to our expectations, it's weak. And on the other hand, they say, let's take China to the WTO to who explain why by devaluating the renminbi, they provide the subsidy to each and every Chinese producer and thus have conquered world markets. So either it is ineffective and you don't want to go there, or it is effective and you want to go even with loaded questions like this one, because quite frankly, nobody in the world thinks this is a subsidy if we take as benchmark the legal definition of subsidy. The devaluation of a currency is generally available, not just to one producer, so you fail the specificity test. So there is a malaise, which there is a lack of satisfaction, there is confusion, and I'm not saying that the US do not have reasons to complain about dispute settlement. Actually, there are good reasons why you should be complaining about dispute settlement, and the question is, what do you do about it? Chad and myself, we've been running for years a gathering of economists and lawyers trained in basic economics who try to understand the rationale behind the findings. We do it every year, and we look at all of the cases. There's no sample bias. All of the case law of the WTO every year. And we bring people from different walks of life as much as possible, and the conclusion is consistently the same, with very few exceptions. Commentators, serious economists, and some lawyers, I mean, we're not lawyerly lawyers, they agree that it's impossible to understand what is the methodology behind those decisions. You just look at words, and an outcome at the end of the day. You don't understand why how they went from A to B to C, very, very often. Now, here I just put an illustration. I can give you a number, but the US lost a couple of cases, it's true, which in my view, at least, shouldn't have lost. I mean, this is a very good example, US tuna, because this is the apotheosis, in my view, of inconsistency. On the one hand, the appellate body says the US measure, it's the reporting requirements are function of the probability to kill dolphins while fishing for tuna. So what did the US do? They calibrate the magnitude, the volume of reporting requirements to the probability to kill dolphins. Calibration, says the panel, is necessary on the one hand. The appellate body, sorry. Few paragraphs below, this is discriminatory. But wait a second. If I apply it in a non-discriminatory manner and it is calibrated, where is the problem? How can it be that it's both at the same? If you look at the US reaction, it was very mild about those things. They didn't bother that much about tuna, but they did bother a lot about zeroing. Now, I don't want to get into the US political economy. There are other people to speak about it. But what I did here is I look at the bigger picture in the last two slides. The first is, if I take the US selfish perspective, say US does not care about the world. Well, if you win 70% of all your claims, and I need much less than that, don't worry. 70% of all claims, you're the highest winner. Well, obviously, it's very difficult to say I'm disappointed with the outcome, quite frankly, especially since the outcome is one case, zeroing. Repeated 20 times over because the US did not want to implement the report. That's where the US lost big time. Now, if you take the cosmopolitan perspective and you say, okay, now I have this regime here, and this regime, it's the only third-party compulsory adjudication regime. Look at any other dispute around the world. If the US has a disagreement with Canada over the frontier should be above or below Maine, unless if they have signed an agreement, you might end up having a war for that. In the WTO, at least, it's not I don't like you, I nuke you. We go to a court to resolve our disputes. So you have a contract which is incomplete. You need agents with some support. You need smart, I wouldn't say smart, but I mean more attuned people. You need, to me, it's unthinkable that we discuss essentially economic issues and there is no economics input in the WTO dispute settlement except for calculating elasticities when I impose countermeasures. So when, for example, we discuss the effect of subsidies, where 5,000 variables can affect the outcome, you don't have one economist sitting in the room and saying, wait a second, there are some instruments that we use in econometrics which can be of help here. They don't exist in WTO case law. This is the kind of attitude I would expect from from a leader. So how can I fix a system which is the only system where disputes are being resolved peacefully and not unilaterally? And I think there is a lot at stake. I mean, I agree with most people, and Chad and me, we have a number of papers saying, look, the remedies are maybe suboptimal and they don't give you the incentive to behave in a WTO consistent. I buy all of this. But there is a difference between the outcome of the case and the eventual implementation, which could be suboptimal for all, and the process itself. And the process is unique in international relations. And I'm afraid the US is putting into question slowly something super valuable to the world community. Because imagine if we go back to the GATT years, because that's what sovereignty means. I keep the right to accept or reject a report. And the US now is in the position of the European Union before the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. My recommendation to this administration, fix it, do not nix it. One last word. It is not that this administration, it's not that the Obama administration went out of its way to help the WTO, not at all. I don't think they did anything to help the WTO. But at least they didn't threaten the existence of dispute settlement the way this administration does. I'll stop here.
All right, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I am going to take China as my main focus. It's not going to be a little illustrative example as with Chad. I'm going to give it the centrality it deserves, and in part because it really is central to this administration's thinking about trade. If you look at the sole PhD economist who is advising President Trump, this is Peter Navarro, he was selected exactly because he had the proper antipathy towards China. As the tale goes, Jared Kushner was instructed to find an economist who thought about these things the right way. A quick Amazon search revealed the book Death by China, and the rest was history. Nor was it uniquely him. Steve Bannon, the dearly departed Steve Bannon from the administration, but was the sort of chief strategist until recently, was out in today's paper, quoted saying that China is Germany 1930. You know, and we have sort of a war and a conflict coming. So this is some of the guiding mentality. I'm not going to dwell on that too much. I would note that if that were all this was, if this was a number of sort of nationalists launching attacks, it might not have gotten the traction that it has. What's actually happened, though, is that there's been some academic work which has given it additional credence. So what I want to do in my remarks, very briefly, is touch on 3 points. One, some of this academic work, which comes from very distinguished authors, but I think is somewhat questionable. And this is the whole stuff involving the China shock. So I want to say a bit about that. I want to come back second to the point that Professor Bhagwati raised of manufacturing and whether we can actually blame China for U.S. manufacturing woes, such as they are, and we can try to characterize them. And then finally, I'll take up a point which Chad introduced, which is what should we be negotiating with China about, and are there actual problems here? And as a preview, the answer is yes, there are actual problems. So let me start then with the China shock. There are really sort of two papers that have given this whole China shock story a lot of credence. One is by Pierce and Schott arguing that there was a China shock, and then there's a series of papers by Otterdorn and Hansen arguing that this actually correlates really well with the sort of pain that we've seen in localities. So let me take each piece separately. The first one is, what was the China shock? And the implication of this work is that the US made a policy error. And it's relevant when we're talking about whether or not we want to embrace protectionism, the theme that we're addressing here today. So their implication is that the policy error was the admission of China into the nascent World Trade Organization in 2001. Now that required something called Permanent Normal Trading Relations, PNTR. And so this seems like throwing a door open to the Chinese, and then look what happened. I guess what I would argue is we need to be quite careful about what actually happened and the way anyone interpreted it at the time. So normal trading relations, this is what used to be called most favored nation until people decided that was really horrible marketing. So normal trading relations means that you put tariffs at the level that you do to all your other, say, fellow GATT or WTO members. In fact, the US had extended that towards the People's Republic of China for a very long time, certainly going back to the 80s. And they had maintained normal trading relations through shocking events such as the events of Tiananmen Square in 1989. So this had been quite a durable policy. The catch was that it wasn't permanent. It needed annual renewal. but it had been renewed annually for a very long time, and I don't think there was much of anyone who, especially, as we sort of went through and then past 1989, perceived that it was very likely that this was going to be reversed, that the U.S. was going to then raise tariffs. So by that telling, 2001 was not that serious a policy choice. It was making permanent de jure something that had been permanent de facto. And for those who sort of worked on this on the Hill, I think that's the way most people saw it. It's a separate discussion that we don't have time for here as to why it is that that's the case. You got empirical results that seem to show an effect. That's another story. I think that the very short version is the thing they were using as a measure was not exogenous. It was endogenous. They basically found that vulnerable industries were vulnerable. But that's a separate discussion. So then the question is, what did this all do, and whether it was a policy choice of this sort or whether it was simply developments happening in China that is this accountable for sort of pain that was suffered, particularly in particular regions of the United States, in the decade that followed? And I'll note, even the authors, Otterdoorn and Hansen, their claim is not that this is sort of an ongoing shock that is still driving the U.S. labor market. They argue this was a facet of the time, and now things are different. Well, I think the real challenge for all economic analysis like this is how do you disentangle a number of concurrent stimuli and try and attribute causality? Which one drove? So the authors in the paper do make some effort to separate out technology, whether that's satisfactory we can set aside, but what's not dealt with, and I think this is a key failing of this argument, is that there are other countries out there. It's not just China. And in fact, how do we know that this is relevant and not just a little bit of chaff that I'm throwing out to distract? We know because of what's happened subsequently. That as China's prices have risen, as it's gotten to be difficult to deal with China, we don't generally see manufacturing decide to move labor-intensive activities back into the United States. They move to neighboring countries who may have had a slightly higher price, but their unit costs were dropping at the same time China's were. So again, it's an attribution error if we conclude, without controlling for these other countries, that China was responsible for U.S. woes. The implication in that work was if it wasn't China, the work would have been done in the U.S., and I think that doesn't, there's very little evidence to support that. Part of this is, the competitors to China and all this were the other countries that I've talked about, and here we're thinking about places like Sri Lanka or Vietnam or Mexico. The other competitor, of course, is technology. So let me set aside the China shock question for a second and turn to technology and to what's been happening in manufacturing. So as Professor Bhagwati mentioned in his introductory remarks, there are downward sloping graphs this is the one point in time I wish I had a PowerPoint. There are downward sloping graphs one can use to describe what's happened in the manufacturing sector. Well, part of what's happened in the manufacturing sector. It is true that if you want to ask what is the share of the U.S. labor force in the manufacturing sector, it is a downward sloping graph. It looks like it is on a remarkably steady decline from about the mid-1960s to about 2010, at which point it plateaus a little bit. And it's a sharp drop. You go from, it was in the 40% range, right around World War II, so now you're somewhere around 8% or something like this. But the parlor game that I like to play, and I spared all of you, is you look at this and you look at the sort of key landmark moments. NAFTA in 1994, or China joining the WTO in 2001, and you just don't see them on this graph. The slope is the same as it was before, the same as it was after. They're not there. Now, I said it matters which graph you're looking at. If you look at manufacturing output, it's not a downward sloping graph. It moves around with macroeconomic shocks, of course. It goes up and down. But actually, manufacturing output has done reasonably well. What we've seen is a technological revolution. We've seen a huge increase in productivity in the manufacturing sector. And the challenge with the administration sort of pointing to China and explaining to relatively low-skilled workers that China is responsible for all of your woes is that it offers them snake oil. It says if only we block these Chinese imports, then once again you'll take your high school degree, you'll go get that factory job, you'll be firmly ensconced in the middle class, and your worries will go away. And there's just really no evidence of that. We're not going to unlearn how to use robots or to mechanize a factory floor. Those are real problems. The people have real issues that need to be addressed. It is actively damaging if you distract yourself with false promises. So that, I think this is the argument for that's the problem with blaming China for manufacturing woes. Now, I don't say all this to exculpate China, to say that China is completely blameless. I agree with the points that Chad made. Now, we have to be a little bit careful. One of my favorite bon mots from Professor Bhagwati is that just because another country throws rocks in their harbor doesn't mean that you should respond by throwing rocks in your own harbor. If a country does something that sort of is self-defeating, we don't need to imitate them. So we definitely want to be asking the question, not just are they taking policies that we think are unwise or unfair, but actually things that harm our national interest. I think you actually can make the case for China that they are doing such policies. Chad mentioned a number of them, and so there'll be some overlap in these lists. I would list things such as inadequate intellectual property protection and forced technology transfer, restrictions on American investment. We see very tight correlations between investment and trade. Excess capacity in key sectors coming from subsidization, steel comes to mind, and the role of state-owned enterprises where you have significant actors in the global scene who may or may not be acting in political fashion rather than with economic motives. So what I will close with is the question, does it matter if we do the right thing for the wrong reason? So I've just said we have some concerns about the way China is behaving. Maybe we're not stating them right. The stated concerns that come out of this administration are much more along the lines of there are big bilateral trade deficits, there's currency manipulation, there's unfairly low prices. Well, those were not my list, but does it actually matter whether those lists match up? Or can you just simply say, I caught them at something, I complained about something, and I'll get some results? I would argue actually that it does matter what we put forward as the actual reasons, and I'll give you two reasons why, and I'll close with this. One is it matters in negotiations. So when we are sitting down, when the United States is sitting down with the Chinese to talk about concerns, you get to identify a small number of issues that are your priorities. And if you are adept at negotiation, those will become the priorities of your negotiating partner. That is what they will try to satisfy. If you go in there and you say, my real concerns are the bilateral trade balance and currency manipulation, then that will be the focus of the discussions. You will not be talking about things like tech transfer. And if you make tech transfer, forced technology transfer number 15 on your list, it will not get a great deal of attention and you will not get results. So you're going to get results if it's number 1 or number 2 on your list. So there's one reason. The second is it matters what kind of public case one makes. And I'll give you an example of this. The Bill Clinton's administration, when they were trying to sell NAFTA, found a very convenient way to make the argument for why NAFTA was good. And you'll notice this is a nice segue because we've got regional trade agreements coming up. But the argument they made was NAFTA is good because we enjoy bilateral trade surpluses with Canada and Mexico. And trade surpluses translate into net jobs. Well, that's not what economists think. We don't think that trade balances translate into jobs, either surpluses or deficits. But it looked nice. You could talk about on average, how many jobs were correlated with exports, and it sounded plausible. And of course, they succeeded in getting NAFTA. What happened? By the end of the decade, you had critics of NAFTA saying, by the administration's own math, NAFTA has failed. What had happened? Well, you had a shift in macroeconomic conditions, and the U.S. was running deficits. But that is the problem with using sort of flawed rationales to try and pursue these policy objectives. It really does matter to match up sort of the right complaints with the right endeavors, and at the moment, the administration hasn't done so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My topic is preferential trade agreements in the multilateral trade system and how these stand in relation to protectionism today. So what I'm going to do is to break up my presentation in roughly 3 pieces. I'll talk a bit about the background of preferential trade agreements, just kind of address a basic question of how it is that in a kind of a multilateral world with the GATT WTO, whose basic principle is non-discrimination, how it is that we have preferential kind of bilateral agreements between countries in the first place. How do these coexist? I'm going to spend some time talking about the debates surrounding this question of kind of preferential trade agreements in the multilateral trade system, what hopes economists and kind of policymakers had for preferential agreements over the last couple of decades, how these have multiplied, and ask the question of whether or not these hopes and expectations have been borne out and where we stand. And finally get to preferential agreements in relation to the headline news of today, where we're sort of every day there's the question of kind of the US has dropped out of TPP, for example. It's renegotiating NAFTA. There's a question of reopening of the Korea-US free trade agreement and so forth. So preferential agreements have been an important piece of kind of headline news today, and we'll sort of get to that at the end. So to begin with, as you all probably know, the GATT WTO system that kind of governs international trade today, the cornerstone principle of this system is non-discrimination. So Article 1 of the GATT says there'll be no discrimination in trade with respect to member countries, or imports from member countries. But alongside this kind of insistence on non-discrimination, the GATT permitted through Article 24 the formation of free trade agreements and customs unions, essentially allowing countries that wanted to liberalize very comprehensively with respect to each other, it allowed them to form free trade agreements. What it also did, or kind of in 1979, a little later, through the enabling clause, was to allow member countries to form preferential agreements, developing countries to form preferential agreements with each other, which were less comprehensive than those allowed by Article 24. So to form a free trade area, you really had to have very comprehensive liberalization with respect to each other, covering almost all trade. But the enabling clause, which was essentially meant to kind of bring in, allow for preferences towards developing countries, allowed the formation of less than fully comprehensive preferential agreements as well. Right? So taken together, the Article 24 agreements as well as enabling clause agreements, what you've seen in terms of the last couple of decades, the dominant trend in the world trade system has been this very, very rapid increase in preferential agreements that have been notified to the GATT under either Article 24 or the enabling clause, right? So you started with really a handful of agreements in the kind of late 1980s to now every country in the world being a member country, one preferential agreement or the other, and on average being a member of 7 different preferential agreements at the same time. So this has kind of been a very big movement in the world trade system over the last several years, and it has sparked off a very interesting, very lively debate among economists about the merits of such preferentialism coexisting with kind of the multilateral system. So on the one hand, proponents of preferential agreements argued very effectively that the proliferation of preferential agreements, such as you've seen, were merely a reflection of the frustration of the slow pace of WTO negotiations. The WTO negotiations involved hundreds of countries really, proceeded too quickly, and that preferential agreements were a more efficient, faster way of getting to trade liberalization that we seek. On the other side, there was kind of a multilateralist opposing this viewpoint, arguing that because of the nature of preferences, that there were kind of inefficiencies that could creep into international trade that could be actually welfare decreasing for the member countries that got into agreements of this sort, that they could be adverse effects on non-member countries that were excluded from these preferential agreements could be negatively affected, and much more importantly, or perhaps just as importantly, that preferential agreements would create incentives against future multilateral liberalization. And finally, that they were not necessarily faster to achieve, that the negotiations over preferential trade were just as tedious, just as difficult as you were seeing in the context of kind of multilateral negotiation. So what has actually been achieved through preferential trade liberalization over the last couple of decades? It is true that we've had hundreds of agreements negotiated, as I've just mentioned, and the number of countries, kind of the fraction of kind of world trade that is taking place between countries that are part of preferential agreements has gone up quite a bit. But if you ask yourself the question, how much trade has actually been liberalized through trade preferences, it turns out that despite these hundreds of agreements in place, the fraction of trade flows receiving any sizable preference is actually quite small. Right? So if you kind of look at the figures published by the WTO, the fraction of world trade that receives greater than a 10% margin of preference is actually less than 2% of world trade. Right? So despite decades of negotiation, once again, hundreds of negotiations, it is not the case that a lot of trade is actually flowing through on a preferential basis. What is also very easily seen and very robustly seen is that the very same sectors that tend to be protected in the context of multilateral negotiations, okay, are the ones that are also protected in the context of bilateral negotiations. And for students of political economy, there's no great surprise there at all. We shouldn't really expect there to be sectors that have kind of resisted liberalization in the context of multilateral negotiations to give up these protections very easily in the context of bilateral agreements. And in fact, that has been the case. Okay. What about speed? How long has it taken to negotiate agreements in a bilateral context? Can we make the case that this has been faster? I would argue that this is not the case. One can simply look at the case of kind of CAFTA-DR. This is the Central American Free Trade Agreement with the U.S. along with Dominican Republic. Those negotiations, the conception of that agreement began kind of the early 1990s when NAFTA was kind of an ongoing negotiation. Serious discussions began in 1997, and it was more than a whole decade later that you actually had an agreement of relatively small magnitude, let's be clear, for that agreement to actually come through. So this argument, this contention that preferential agreements would be more efficient in kind of liberalizing trade has also not necessarily been borne out in the context of particular agreements, and you might have other agreements in mind that you favor. It is also the case, the literature is a little mixed on the question of whether or not these preferential agreements have been harmful or helpful to the countries that have engaged in such deals. There are significant examples that have been sort of studied in the literature where you have instances of very large levels of what was referred to as trade diversion, the possibility that this preference that you're providing to partner countries is enabling inefficient suppliers in those countries to survive competition from the rest of the world and provide goods to you while they might not have been able to do so otherwise, right? So it's kind of a discrimination that's allowing you to survive, allowing you to export, and there's kind of negative economic consequences of that have been identified in the literature as well, although I will say that the effects there have been a little mixed. Another argument, an important one that's been sort of put out there as kind of an important driver for preferential agreements and for us to kind of favor preferential agreements has been this argument about deep integration, this argument that the motivation for trade preferences has relatively little to do with international trade, and that really preferential agreements have to be understood as platforms for undertaking deeper forms of integration, institutional harmonization between member countries, various other things, right? And so this is an issue, how well have preferential agreements actually done in terms of kind of deeper integration with each other is a question that we can ask as well. There's a wonderful WTO database which codifies institutional provisions within preferential agreements, and I just provide a kind of this table here for you to see, where we're looking here at issues which are listed here as WTO minus areas. These are issues that are not covered in general by WTO kind of multilateral agreements, but that are mentioned in preferential agreements and that are mentioned in a manner that is legally enforceable, right? And you'll notice very quickly that outside of regulations on investment, capital flows, a whole range of other questions, institutional harmonization has actually not taken place. It's even if these issues are kind of mentioned in the text of preferential agreements, there's no language within those agreements that supports any legal enforceability of them. And so preferential agreements on the whole, in my view, have not been quite as good in achieving this kind of deeper integration as many might have hoped. From the standpoint of this question of how these trade preferences interact with the multilateral trade system, whether they're going to encourage future multilateral liberalization or not, it's not obvious actually that this deeper integration that many had hoped for was actually a good thing, because different agreements might achieve deeper integration on different dimensions, and then these become hard to reconcile at a later stage, right? And it's going to be in the build-up to TPP. It's very clear, for instance, the Trans-Pacific Partnership had emphasized a variety of issues that were rather different from the issues being emphasized in the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, being led by China. And if one were to envision a world in the future where these two agreements would somehow merge, it would be very difficult to kind of reconcile these different points, because one agreement had emphasized one set of issues and the other had emphasized something quite different. Okay. Let me skip over, maybe quickly mention that there's kind of very big question that had been actually first formulated in these terms by Professor Jagdish Bhagwati that led to kind of 2 decades or longer literature on whether or not preferential agreements would serve as kind of building blocks in terms of kind of further liberalization towards kind of, will they help us achieve multilateral liberalization, or will they otherwise actually serve as stumbling blocks? Will they prevent further liberalization being undertaken by member countries? When one looks at kind of the behavior of tariffs, whether these countries have member countries of preferential agreements have done better with respect to kind of lowering tariffs with respect to non-members, that evidence is a bit mixed. Different studies have found different things. But when one looks at non-tariff barriers, anti-dumping duties in particular, you see that there's a rather aggressive behavior towards non-member countries in the form of anti-dumping actions that have been initiated by member countries in preferential agreements. This chart shows you how much, to what greater frequency, by what greater frequency, the target countries for anti-dumping duties have been non-member countries subsequent to the formation of preferential trade agreements, the number going up from 58% to 90%, reflecting kind of protection diversion in a certain sense, and more aggressive behavior towards non-member countries. Let me also add very quickly that trade preferences have not been neutral with respect to kind of multilateral negotiations, for instance, with the Doha round. Okay, so one very quickly, easily observed fact is that the exporting nations, in terms of exporting nations that exported agriculture to kind of from the developing world to the developed countries, on the one hand, we might have thought, when you kind of look at Doha round from a distance, which is really kind of the Doha development round is about to kind of remove subsidies and so forth from developed countries, export subsidies, production subsidies, that would raise international prices of food. One might have imagined that the developing countries would be somewhat united in their approach in Doha. But because of the fact that a variety of developing countries already had access to developing countries, let's say through the everything but arms agreement, access to the European markets, a number of developing countries that already had preferential access to the European market were actually opposed to Doha liberalization. Okay, so because that liberalization would have eroded preferences that they already enjoyed. Same thing with the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. If you already have access to the US market on a preferential basis, it does not serve your interests to have a successful Doha round, because that's going to be taking away preferential access that you already have. So that led to a split within the set of developing countries in the context of Doha, so that kind of the trade preferences were non-neutral in that sense. Be all of this as it may, the proponents of preferential agreements, as I said at the beginning, had sort of hoped that the existing trade blocs would somehow become bigger in size, potentially merge into ever larger configurations till we get to the point where we have multilateral free trade. And for a while, I have to say that even for many of those, including myself, who had kind of opposed preferential agreements, it sort of appeared as if the world might actually be moving in that fashion. So on the one hand, you had the US, say, moving from your Canada-US free trade agreement to something bigger, NAFTA, then proposing ever bigger agreements, TPP with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTIP, and so forth. Okay. It was already clear to many that this was kind of the merger of these agreements in the future was not going to be an easy thing to do. These were fundamentally different agreements, as I've already mentioned. But very surprisingly, what you have is a kind of a reversal of this. This is, as Professor Bhagwati was saying earlier, that you're going to come back to the starting point, that the US has clearly dropped out of TPP. TTIP negotiations are stalled. And rather than going forward in terms of combining agreements, the U.S. is threatening to terminate existing bilateral agreements, to renegotiate them, and so forth. And this is not the challenges with trade preferences, not just in the context of the U.S. If you look at kind of Brexit, when you look at the negotiations between the U.K. and the European Union, you have a similar issue. The fact that they were part of a preferential agreement together and negotiated many things jointly has now become an issue as the U.K. tries to figure out the new dispensation with respect to the European Union. How do you negotiate? How do you split up the quotas that New Zealand, for instance, might have negotiated jointly with the European Union? How do you break those up with respect to the U.K., with respect to the remaining countries in Europe, and so forth? These are going to be very, very challenging issues to think about and to deal with. So let me conclude by just saying this. From a kind of multilateral perspective, there were many doubts that one had about preferential agreements. These nevertheless marched forward. For a while, it looked like they might actually be these larger configurations and some hope of a merger of these agreements into kind of a large coalitions. But as we stand today, there's considerable uncertainty about the future of trade agreements. There's very clear threats to existing agreements already, which we've mentioned, NAFTA, Korea, TPP, and so forth. But even more fundamentally, not only is the Trump administration kind of moving back and kind of going backwards in the direction from the standpoint of discussions over trade agreements, your public pronouncements by officials have also made you wonder what their positions are on issues having to do with something even more fundamental, which is Article 1 of the GATT. So the recent meetings of the annual meetings of the Bank and the Fund, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin kind of made this point that from his standpoint, the way that they would deal with trade policy was to impose on countries whatever tariffs those countries imposed on the U.S., right? This is a fundamental break with non-discrimination. So Article 1 of the GATT. So it's not just Article 24 that you're having challenges with, it's Article 1 as well. And where we end up in a year from now or 2 years from now is anybody's guess, and we'll wait and see. All right, thank you very much. So we now open up for questions from the floor. We have 2 mics, one on either side. If you'd like to queue up behind, maybe briefly introduce yourselves and then give us your questions or comments. Please. Yeah.
Praveen,
Yes.
they just wanted me to make an announcement that the World Trade System, the book is being advertised over there. Okay, so you might, it's on sale over there, in that corner. Okay? That's a self-serving announcement by me.
No tariffs on that.
Authors of the book.
Hi, my name is Patrick Gillespie. I'm with CNN. I'm wondering, to play a bit of devil's advocate, the Trump administration has said they will withdraw from NAFTA if they can't reach a better deal. Phil and Chad have spoken about what a better deal could potentially look like, but I'm wondering, to play devil's advocate, a lot of people say, including leaders in Mexico and Canada, say this is just the negotiating tactic. Why don't we believe that he'll actually try to withdraw? I mean, a year ago, nobody thought he would win the election, so why don't we believe it this time?
All right, I can take a shot at that, and I'm sure my colleagues may want to weigh in. I don't think we're out of the woods on this. I think there is a chance that the president will choose to withdraw. He's repeatedly expressed his desire to do so, and he's the president of the United States. So there's a legal argument now going on. I'm not a lawyer. I know some, but there's a legal argument among sort of U.S. scholars on this. Does the president actually have the authority to do this? Given that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that it's Congress that regulates these things, can he? You can make a rational argument for why he ought not to. And I think we saw that when there was the attempt to do this in late April, I believe it was, which was it really hurts the United States if you attempt to withdraw from NAFTA, or if you do withdraw. If all you consider are tariffs, and there's much more at stake here than just tariffs, but if all you consider are tariffs, and we revert back to pre-NAFTA tariff levels against Mexico, Mexico had tariffs on the order of 15% against the United States, the U.S. had tariffs on the order of 3% against Mexico. So I think part of what's happened here is that NAFTA has been held up as the symbol of a lot of angst that people are facing. The angst is real, but NAFTA as a causal mechanism is not.
Can I add to that one particular point? Because I think President Obama, when he was running for the election against Hillary way back, he had also said that he was going to renegotiate NAFTA. People have forgotten that. Now, at that time, some of us interpreted this as a bone to be thrown to the protectionists in the Democratic Party, because apparently what Obama was looking for was something like going to Acapulco or something, eating, Mexican food, enjoying life, and then coming back and saying, I tried to renegotiate, but renegotiate what? Bringing all kinds, trade, environment, democracy, all kinds of things into the central agreement. He knew it would never happen. And so he would be able to come back and say, I tried. And then he's in the clear. Unlike him, Hillary really was wanting to do something really nasty to the trading system. So some of us voted for Obama because he was actually, when he said he was renegotiating NAFTA, he really didn't mean anything protectionist. What is different this time is that it is protectionism on the part of Trump. And I think there the main point, what you're noticing actually, is something which we trade economists have written about for long, which is that export interests, if you try and renegotiate something, they're going to be upset because they will lose certain privileges which had been negotiated for their export market. They play a role in actually undermining any movement towards dismantling NAFTA, unless you get something really to substitute for it. And we don't know anything at all about that. So I think what's happening is, around the world you are seeing this particular phenomenon, that if you try and unravel a system where you've gotten some sub-concessions, no matter how badly or how, you are never going to be able to unravel them without export interests kicking in. And that is the greatest reason for not being able to unravel agreements which you've signed. Yeah, I think, Chad, you...
Pat, it's a really good question. I would make 2 points, and I think to pick up on what Jagdish just said, I might disagree a little bit in that I think President Obama would argue that he did ultimately renegotiate NAFTA through the TPP. Yes, he added on, 8 more countries, but it made, labor and environment enforceable and upgraded things on electronic commerce and those kinds of things. So I think, ultimately that's what he did. But to your more specific question, and I think this also ties in with one of the points that I thought Phil made quite eloquently about why it's important to kind of target the things that matter, because that's what's ultimately you're going to be negotiating over. The fundamental concern that I have with the Trump administration in the NAFTA context, and I also agree with Phil, I don't think we're out of the woods on this at all, is their singular focus on bilateral trade deficits, right? That's bullet point number 1 in their NAFTA negotiating objectives. And if you think you can negotiate that into a trade agreement, we've never seen it. In Canada and Mexico, it's like reinventing math. And Canada and Mexico are going to say, we can't do it, right? It's not something that you can write down into a trade agreement unless you're going to managed economies, right, and central planning. And that's not a world in which we live. And so until the Trump administration backs off of this continued singular focus on bilateral trade deficits as their objective, I will remain worried that that's ultimately what will hold up their ability to accept any kind of a deal.
Just to add to that, I mean, it's a little hard to make sense of kind of the daily kind of comments through Twitter and so forth, Donald Trump. And I appreciated the Mexican authorities responding. I think I can't remember if it was the Foreign Ministry or the Trade. saying that Mexico will not renegotiate NAFTA through Twitter, right? We'll see what happens.
There are no more questions. We can go home.
I'm Chandrakant Pancholi, and my question is for Professor Krishna. You just explained that there are several bilateral and multilateral and preferential agreements. Do you have any solution as to what should be done about this? And can you tell us about the faults that WTO has?
Sorry, I didn't get the very last part. Can you tell us about the
The policy, the WTO.
What kind of
What
The rules-
What can the WTO do?
what
what can?
are the faults that people have?
No, it's an incredibly challenging question for sure. Okay. So, in sum, what is the solution to this issue of the proliferation of preferential agreements? What can the WTO do to achieve maybe a multilateral solution that is a good alternative to preferential agreements? Perhaps that's a way of summarizing the question. This is a challenging set of issues, right? On the one hand, WTO is after all composed of countries, right? And so if you had the leadership in the major trading countries in the world take either a principled or otherwise informed view that what they wanted to do was to support multilateral approaches rather than bilateral approaches. Hypothetically, if that was the case, then you would certainly see greater success at the WTO in terms of multilateral negotiations, multilateral outcomes. That, unfortunately, is not the case. And this is not just an issue of the Trump administration, right? So the movement in the US, the movement away from kind of principled multilateralism at some level towards bilateral agreements of one form or the other, began late 1980s, evolved very, very quickly through multiple administrations, Democratic and Republican and so forth. And so one has to interpret from that there is a view that there's something to be gained, that the US sees something to be gained by negotiating on a bilateral basis rather than a multilateral one. Others on the panel have already expressed that the Obama administration didn't do much either to support the multilateral process or Doha and so on and so forth, right? So until that is seen differently for principal reasons or real economic reasons or political reasons, I don't necessarily see how you're going to have the multilateral process overwhelm these forces that push in favor of bilateralism, so long as the large, powerful countries see it in their advantage to negotiate on a bilateral basis. Maybe they get more out of these agreements, maybe there's greater leverage negotiating one-on-one or something else. Let me turn this over to
Can I just ask Phil and Chad one question about this? Because I think somebody said that in these bilateral negotiations, you're going to likely to see voluntary export restraints. Somebody said that, I can't forget who. You did, Chad. But it seems to me that you are more likely to see, for instance, if you go to the Korean one, people are worried about surpluses and deficits, that you have too much surplus, that the market is not open. You're going to see what I call voluntary import expansions, meaning imposing on you bilaterally requirement to import more. And that is something we saw with respect to Japan, right? Way back. And that's been studied in the literature too. So I call them VIEs. And I think looking at what Korea might face is demands for VIEs. Make sure you import a certain amount. That's the only test we have for your market being open. VERs are kind of old-fashioned now. I don't think VERs are, voluntary export restraints are particularly, fascinating in bilateral negotiations. But you might be interested in what their reply is, because Korea is likely to face this, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so I wasn't advocating by any stretch for voluntary export restraints. It's just something, it was a policy that we actively saw in the 1980s that I wouldn't be surprised to see revived, and I wouldn't be surprised to see voluntary import expansions revived as well. In fact, I think Peter Navarro in the Oval Office was quoted back in March when they were talking about the Buy America provisions, that he wanted these to apply not only in the United States, but in other countries, I think the context was Germany as well. And if you think about Germany buying America, right, or buying American, that's essentially a voluntary import expansion. So I agree with that.
You should advise your government.
Just one thing on this point. Keep in mind that we should not overstate the bite of bilaterals nowadays, because if you look empirically, the majority of the content is regulatory. And if it is regulatory, it has to be MFN. You cannot have one environmental policy towards your FTA partner and different towards outsiders. We sat down with Andres Sapir a few years ago to check the EU and the US FTAs. It depends on if you like our coding or not, but 82% of the content is regulatory. I mean, this is the only thing the FTA does is ease negotiating costs, but the discipline eventually has to be MFN. You cannot apply it in different way towards partners and non-partners. So it's only tariffs, essentially. This is the only thing that...
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for this panel and for your remarks. My name is Jim Prusky. I'm actually a former SEPA student. For the last 15 years, I've run an international trade finance fund focused on agricultural exports in Latin America and Asia. In each of your remarks, as clear and coherent as they were, you ended with a question mark. And I think the question mark, for me, comes from the fact that where things seem to be with the administration, with many of the instruments, the global instruments of trade, there are a lot of question marks because there are questions about whether the rules will even be followed, whether the rules apply any further. So I guess my question is, could you talk a little bit about what happens after the question mark? And from your standpoint, as international trade academics and practitioners, what are the types of things that can be done to make sure that people and the world is aware that the rhetoric or discussion of new policies and the path that we seem to be on right now is not necessarily good for everybody. Is not good for the United States and for the world in general. Thank you.
Let me take a stab.
Yeah,
I'm closer to Pravin. So, Chad will get to say. I guess, so I've written about this a little bit in the NAFTA context, which I think may help answer this. If you look at the Trump administration, what do they have to deal with in sort of NAFTA renegotiation? They've got a bunch of constituent groups to whom they have to answer, and sort of grouping them very broadly. They've got the kind of people who are very enthusiastic as critics, the sort of Steve Bannons and the others who say, you've really got to completely rip up or change that. So there's the sort of nationalist school. There you have to deal with the business sectors of the United States. So some of that is sort of the membership of the U.S. Chamber, the agricultural sector. They all have interests. You have to deal with your fellow negotiating countries, because if you want to actually get something done, you need to get Canada and Mexico to agree. And then you have to deal with members of Congress, because if you don't actually get something through Congress, as President Obama aptly demonstrated with the TPP, it doesn't count for very much. I'm not sure that was your conclusion, but that's my interpretation of what Chad said. So you've got to do all of those. How will the reason at least I ended it with question marks is, so how will the Trump administration balance all those things out? Well, what can we look to for guidance? Can we look at his past experience as a policy leader? There is no past experience as a policy leader. So we don't have a great deal to base this on to give an analysis. Not only that, there's a great academic tradition of always concluding in the end that more research is necessary. So that.
Chad?
So, I mean, it's the right question. I think Phil answered it one way quite eloquently, and so I'll take a just different tack, which is to say, if I weren't constrained by the current administration's misguided focus, and I was interested in overcoming the current problems in the trading system and addressing them head on, how would I do it? Well, I think I do see the conflict between China and the West in sort of the non-market economy, involvement of the state, industrial planning. It's a different kind of system with everybody else is the central conflict. And I don't mean this in a militaristic kind of way. I just see it as different economies not necessarily functioning well under the current rules. But I think there's opportunity there to engage and negotiate directly. I think we'd have to put to the side this idea that Doha might ever be done. We just have to recognize that it's dead, and we have to start over. And we have to figure out what are the key areas of conflict between China and everybody else. Do we need to write a new set of rules that somehow incentivizes China to become like everybody else? Or is it possible for us to have a set of rules in which China can keep doing what it's doing, everybody else does what it does, and these rules provide a buffer that we can all get along? And I'm not sure we have good answers to those yet. I don't think we have them even in the academic literature to fully understand what it is. But I think that's the discussion that we need to be headed down. How do you do that? Well, I think you do it through an agreement in an organization like the WTO. But I think it also requires leadership and patience and thinking and goodwill, which, you know, there's a lot of that lacking right now, not only in the United States, but in a lot of places around the world.
You also asked about kind of reshaping of the narrative, how do you convince people and so forth. So one issue that this panel has sort of stayed away from, perhaps consciously a little bit, is the issue of trade and income distribution, kind of deindustrialization, what's happening to the bottom 10%, what's happening to the bottom 30%. Professor Bhagwati spoke about it a bit at the beginning, but this is going to be a topic for the second panel. That said, clearly that narrative has taken hold, that at least in the developed countries, that trade might be linked to deindustrialization, that it might be linked to kind of concentrations of wealth. And as much as economists have kind of written about the benefits of trade liberalization in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of a variety of other things, I think greater and more sustained engagement on that particular point will be necessary in the future, right? To engage the realities such as there might be, propose arguments, counter-arguments, really examine that question in a deeper manner than has been done so far, and in a more sustained, continuous manner than has been done so far. Professor Desai. Yes.
A question on the Chinese economy, which has figured much in our discussion here. In the 1970s, 80s, 90s, the Chinese economy grew at probably 7 to 9% real annual GDP growth. And it's possible that much of the growth was prompted by trade. In those days, American markets were flooded with Chinese goods. I mean, you go to the stores and whatever, umbrellas, clothing, shoes, made in China, made in China. It seems to me that that is no longer possible because the one-child policy has finally resulted in labor shortage in China. Wages have gone up, and it would seem to me that the amount of renminbi devaluation which the Chinese policymakers might undertake is not going to fight the rise in wages, prices of goods at home. So trade does not seem to me now to be a medium of growth for the Chinese economy. Would our speakers like to comment on that?
You want to go?
Sure. Well, thank you. I think those are excellent points. It's a subject of some debate just how much trade contributed to Chinese growth on this. Those who are skeptical will point out that it was a reasonably small fraction of the output of the Chinese economy. Those who are proponents will say yes, but it played a disproportionate role in sort of technological change and employment. I'm in the latter camp. I think it actually did play a fairly large role. I think your point about demographics is excellent and very important, that a lot of the discussion we've been having about China is behind the times, that it was from a time when they had this unusual bulge in the labor force, which was a combination of the one-child policy and is now passing, that now you have a shrinking labor force. And so you, as you very well know, you look at economic growth, and some of this is, you know, what's happening to your factor growth and then what's happening to the productivity of those factors. The last point I would make is on that productivity. I think this is the other reason we can be a little bit skeptical of Chinese growth prospects for the future, which is that it's one thing as you are pushing up towards the production possibilities frontier, you can get extraordinary rates of growth as you are sort of catching up and adopting the technology of others. Once you get to that frontier, now you are limited by the rate of growth of sort of technological change more broadly. And I think this is where China is facing some very difficult choices, because I don't think they have implemented, when I talk about their intellectual property policies, I don't think they've implemented the kind of policies that foster innovation of the sort they would need to maintain that level of growth. So I would just simply add that to the excellent points you already made.
Just one thing to add to that is that just as labor force is shrinking in China, we're also hearing a lot about automation and technological change. And if that's actually true, meaning there's labor-saving technological change, capital-intensive, then maybe the Chinese would not be hurt by as much as they might have been had they had the same level of population growth with the type of technological change that we're seeing. Gentlemen in the back, Professor Desai, if you could pass the mic back. Yes.
Since I'm in the same demographic as Professor Desai, I may be permitted to ask the question from here. The name is Subhan from Bangladesh. Actually, the discussion is centered around trade, which is what this is all about. But trade itself reflects the changes in the global economy and the relative changes in the competitiveness of different countries. Now, the bottom line seems to be that the United States today is no longer the most competitive country in the world as it once was, and it is not likely to be so in most areas where it was traditionally dominant. So, however much you push around different trade policies, all of them are essentially designed to protect the US economy, not to make it more competitive. So, objectively, what is going to be the political outcome of this process? If the US is losing competitiveness all over the market, where will, in fact, the US really then take its economy merely by finding different devices to protect itself?
Well, I think one way to answer that question is to tie a little bit back into the last one, which is where the Trump administration's ultimate focus is going to be. And if it's going to be fighting the fights of kind of the declining industries and manufacturing and steel, that have been challenged by import competition long predating the rise of China, that's not going to do much. I think what is a little bit different is this more recent action they're taking, this Section 301 investigation into forced technology transfer and intellectual property, because that really is the potential to think about what the next generation of industrial concern in the United States is, which is that China is now, they're not doing indigenous innovation necessarily, but they're acquiring the technology, and how we manage that process and what rules we have in place to deal with it. I think American companies aren't necessarily happy with it, but we're not clear how unhappy with it they are. Some of that which they engage in this sort of activity is voluntary when they form these joint ventures. Some of it's not. And this is really, I think, what the crux of the question is. The next challenge facing the next round of industries for the United States in dealing with China, and how serious the Trump administration really is to focus on that, and what their approach is ultimately going to be in dealing with China on that issue. So I think it's a big question.
Yes.
So I take advantage of the proximity of the mic to ask the question. I've been one of the questions. So there are two things going on, and relating to the points you were making, Praveen, I think, about this concerns about income distribution, employment, trade, the whole nexus of things. With that, a lot of the populist rhetoric is around those kind of issues. See, one of the questions, there is a global tendency for deindustrialization and especially in the share of manufacturing employment in total employment. That's all sorts of things going on there. Peaking at industrialization and peaking at lower levels of GDP than historically. Question is, the two things, that's clearly indicates there's technological change that is affecting manufacturing and employment in manufacturing. Question, in the United States, I'm sure there's a lot of good empirical work done in it, but what's the upshot of how much of the sort of dampening effect of manufacturing employment because of technology, and how much of it trade with countries with abundant labor? I mean, that's politically a very important issue, I think, for people who want to fight protectionism to grapple with. Right.
Let me say one quick thing before turning it over to Phil. If you look at kind of the fraction of non-farm employment relative to total that's in manufacturing in the US, that's been very, very steadily declining from the 1940s, 1950s onwards, from maybe around 30 to 40% then to about 10% or so, right? And so this is over different phases of globalization, different levels of trade engagement, different types of technological change, and so on and so forth. It's just been a very steady decline. The one argument that people have made recently is that in the last decade or so, with the intensification of trade with China, that has accelerated even a little bit further, right? So there are different types of studies that will give you different answers on how much of this you can load on to technological change, how much of this is trade with China or other developing countries. I don't think there's one figure that we could all agree
Is
upon.
there some empirical consensus on some basic broad
Consensus among
numbers
academics?
on the relative importance of the two, technological change versus trade?
I wouldn't necessarily say there's broad consensus. There are some numbers that one could sort of put on the table. There's a paper about kind of the effects of outsourcing, for example, how much of it was, if you could look at employment changes, how much of it was technological change, how much of it was outsourcing. People might say 10 to 15% was international trade, some other fraction was technological change, and so forth. But let me turn this over. Phil's done quite a bit of work on this. Let me separation. Yeah.
I think Pravin put that very well. No, I don't think there's a consensus number. I think it had tilted that maybe there's a push now to expand a bit the amount that's attributed to trade. That's what I was taking issue with somewhat. One of the reasons we'd always been a little bit hesitant about attributing things to trade was, well, two. One, that what we described as this technological advance that sort of had continued and seemed uncorrelated with trade measures. The other thing is, if we look at our standard trade models, the prediction, like our basic Heckscher-Ohlin model, the prediction would be that if this was happening and one country was therefore sort of turning away from labor, the other would be going in the opposite direction. And yet we've been seeing this as something of a global phenomenon. So, but no, I don't think you have a consensus number. The one thing I would note, and your sort of very interesting question, it's not so much necessarily a turning away from labor. It is somewhat, but one of the reasons you're feeling the effect so acutely in the US is it's a different kind of labor. And so I am now in the Midwest. You talk to manufacturing CEOs, and they will talk about labor shortages that they're having in manufacturing. And you might think for a moment, well, how can this be? We've just been talking about the disappearance of manufacturing jobs. Well, the explanation is they're not looking for the person with a high school degree who can move pallets across the factory floor. They're looking for somebody who has at least 2 years of technical college, who can perhaps reprogram that computer-guided machine tool. That's a different skill set. So again, this is one of the reasons that we know that there's a change and it's having something to do with technology. But so it's not purely the overall number of jobs, but that changing nature, which is small consolation to the person who just had the high school degree.
And just to quickly say that this lack of consensus comes from a fundamental concern, which is that these two issues are not necessarily separate from each other. It could be that technological change is driving the patterns of international trade and vice versa. And so one has to be very careful about how one separates these two things out. We've actually run out of time. I don't know if you want to take one last question or just stop here. Okay, right. I've got my orders from the boss, so we'll stop here. Let me thank all the panelists.